I think today I'd first like to bring some sort of a context to this discussion and give you a flavour of how the passport's evolved, and then in just a couple of minutes I'll try and put into a nutshell what we do as an expert. And so I guess in the spirit of disclosure, I am a member of the UCI's expert panel. I was also on the WADA's committee who were charged with developing the athlete passport guidelines. I didn't develop the ABP software, that was developed in the Lausanne laboratory. I did work with a statistician here in Victoria, Ken Sharp, to develop what we call the 3G model, the third generation approach of off-score. Essentially, what we proposed then is identical to what the athlete blood passport does today. So I think there is some merit in saying I developed the passport, except we came up with a similar approach, but we didn't develop the ABP software. Now, to put it in some context, blood is an organ. It's not an organ in the sense of a kidney that you can cut a kidney out, put it onto a table and say, there it is, that's where it begins, that's where it finishes. Blood, you would most probably have this concept in your mind of this red fluid, and you could perhaps even take it out of the body and put it into a bucket if we had that technology. When you actually drill down to it, there's no beginning and end of blood. The barrier between blood and interstitial fluid, your flesh if you like, are gaps in cells which water passes in and out completely freely. So although it's convenient to think of blood as being something that you could pick up and hold and measure, it's not the reality. And we also know that blood does respond to doping, so that if you infuse a bag of blood into someone, the haemoglobin levels will increase. If you treat someone with erythropoietin, the blood levels will increase. So within this sort of matrix of this entity of blood, we know how it behaves even though we can't measure it exactly. I think back in the late sort of 90s, that's where the hematocrit rule came in that sort of paradigm. Well, we know when you take EPO transfuse, haemoglobin levels go up. We're going to set a limit of 50%. So if your blood's above 50%, you don't start. There's a no-start penalty. That was effective. It put a ceiling, if you like, on doping, but it wasn't the best that we could do. And the passport is a step further down the evolution of that. It says, well, some people could have a naturally high hematocrit, and so if you have a 50% rule, it's unfair to them compared to someone who had a relatively low hematocrit, who could then dope up until 50%, get that performance advantage and be equal to someone whose value was already 50% naturally. And the paradigm there is, well, if we know what your natural value is, instead of saying everyone can get to 50%, we say, well, everyone can get to a limit based on what your natural value is. And so we collect blood samples in order to estimate what the individual athlete's true value is, and then we set guidelines above and below that which are comparable to the hematocrit rule, except they're phrased in a different context, and there's different statistics that are used to generate those thresholds. Cast your minds back to 2006 and you've got Operation Puerto. There were some pretty serious crises facing the UCI. It was at the same time that this biological passport actually began to get some traction in the consciousness of anti-doping authorities. As well, you had the WADA take ownership of this blood passport concept. They've been funding it for many years doing the background research. And I think when you see those three things together, and retrospectively you can look back on it, I think the UCI and the WADA perhaps overzealously grabbed this passport and said, we're going to use this and we're going to run with it. And I think whether it was the media or whether it was those agencies or whether it was perhaps a misunderstanding by the scientific community, it's gone forward and a lot of people think of it as a cure-all. It's the solution, that if you have the passport in place, your athletes aren't doping. That's never been the reality. It's a perception, I acknowledge, but it's not the reality. And so to say that the passport is flawed because it doesn't catch everyone, that some people can get around it, is not particularly revelatory. It's the best thing that we have available to us. I'm confident of that. I've not seen anything that would improve our ability to flag athletes who we suspect are doping. So I think that's a position that we find ourselves in today. It began on a sound scientific basis. It initially got misconstrued as a cure-all, and I think in the last 6 months or so there's beginning to be this sort of trickle down, okay, so it's good but it's not perfect. Now, with that background in place, just for a couple of minutes to explain how this passport actually works. A blood sample is collected in the field from, we'll talk about riders because this is about the UCI. Blood samples collected, it's sent to a laboratory. At the moment they have to be WADA accredited laboratories who measure the blood sample. Those results go into a central database that is at the moment managed at the Lausanne laboratory. There, those results are put into whoever's rider's profile the sample belongs to. It's anonymous at the Lausanne laboratory. Any of those results that go into the passport are treated automatically. It's like a spreadsheet in a sense. And anything that exceeds those thresholds that you saw earlier is sent to the experts who are rostered on for that particular week to review the profiles. At that point, it's still anonymous. We receive the profile, we look at it, and the process that we go through is to think, okay, well, it's over the limit. What might have caused that? And it's not something that was conscious in my mind until I started to speak with Martin Hardy and people like that. I did actually go through a process unconsciously of saying, well, if there was a reasonable explanation other than doping that could have caused that profile, I would never recommend the UCI to proceed with the case. But it wasn't actually crystallised in my mind until I started to get some understanding of the sort of the legal landscape that we had to navigate. If I deem a profile to be abnormal, I can't think of any other reason why it would have been above there other than doping. I give that opinion back to the UCI. They collate opinions from the other two experts that are rostered on that week. At that point, the UCI reviews it, and if all three experts have said it's an abnormal profile, it then goes back out to the whole panel of 9 experts. So 3 per week, but if a profile is considered abnormal, it then goes to the 9 experts. All 9 experts then review it, and so you're getting as much of a sea of opinion that we can get. If all of those 9 experts still say, no, look, this is doping, I can't think of anything else that would explain it, that then comes into a category where at the moment there would be meetings probably every 6 months or so, face-to-face meetings where the experts get together, sit down and go through in detail all the profiles from the previous 6 months that have exceeded that sort of unanimous, we can't think of another reason other than doping for this profile. At that point, if again the decision is still unanimous, the rider is notified and they're given an opportunity to explain why that profile looks the way that it did. That explanation is then given back to us experts. So we have the profile in one hand, we have the athlete's explanation in the other hand. We look at that, and if we still aren't satisfied that there's a non-doping explanation, we then formally give an opinion to the UCI that, as Martin's explained earlier, it's essentially at that point that we say to the UCI, we recommend that you open a case. It's still completely, beg your pardon, it's not anonymous from the time the athlete gives their explanation to us. At that point, we know who the athlete is. Obviously, when an athlete's writing an explanation, it becomes impossible to maintain anonymity.